Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode, a brand new season of Say Again, a podcast that I kicked off last year. I'm Amrita Tripathi, your host, and I'm so happy to have with us from Washington, D.C., Tanvi Madan. She's a senior fellow, Foreign Policy, Center for Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution in D.C. She's also an author. Her book, Fateful Triangle: How China Shaped US India Relations During the Cold War, came out a while ago. And Tanvi, you've also been the host of the Global Indian podcast. So we'll take some tips from you on podcasting in general. Thanks so much for taking out the time.
Thanks, Amrita. It's really wonderful to be with you on the podcast.
It's giving me a little bit of a throwback to, I don't know what, how many, was it 10 to 15 years ago,
hmm
back in the day? But I don't think I could have asked you a question like this back then from a mainstream journalist point of view. But I'm going to just kick off by asking you, what is going on in Washington, D.C.? Looking at all of the headlines coming out of the US, there's a lot of concern, I think, globally, and I'm sure in the US as well. Can you share a little bit from your vantage point?
Transitions here between one administration to another, in general, tend to be times of change in Washington. This is a little bit like Delhi in terms of being a one-horse town. Not, Delhi at least I think is a little bit more diversified. But here, you either work in government or a significant amount of the society, economy, people are connected, their jobs, their livelihoods, their kind of lives in general are connected to the federal government in particular. And so, whenever there's a change in transition, there's a transition between one president to another, there is some kind of change, definitely. I think even in 2016, when you saw the transition between President Obama to President Trump, and now again this year, it's not just change, it's disruptiveness. And, and some people consider that good and some people consider that bad. I think one of the things is not just the scale of change that we're seeing this time, but one thing we did see the last time as well, which is, you see more so this time, but you saw it in the previous Trump administration as well, which is flooding the zone. Doing the kind of incoming team, just taking multiple actions where you're seeing, people not knowing how to react because so many things are going on at any given time. And so there's this phrase that's used in DC, OBE, overtaken by events. And usually that's, said to, if there's a crisis and or you needed to do something and something else happened. In this case, that overtaken by events could be said every few hours, let alone every kind of every week or every month. So I think just the scale and pace of change that we're seeing. I would also say the nature of change. We saw this last time in the Trump administration. I think again we're seeing this on speed this time, which is the nature of the change is partly that the president himself doesn't have very clear ideological views that fell on party lines, Democrat or Republican. He also doesn't, there's certain kind of sacred cows, so to speak, that people would never even refer to in the past, and he just goes ahead and says we're going to try this. So for instance, on the one hand, with Israeli leader Bibi Netanyahu throwing out comments on the future of Gaza, which would have made Bibi Netanyahu happy. But in the next few hours after that meeting, having upset a whole lot of constituencies on that side and probably making Bibi Netanyahu very happy, then President Trump throws out the potential for a deal with Iran, which, if you're Bibi Netanyahu, you don't want to see. And in fact, Trump distancing himself from the Israeli position on Iran. So to me, that is something, as an analyst, part of it is you just keeping up with, and then keeping up with developments, knowing that they are going to change very quickly, and needing to both keep an eye on what's happening in the broader context, political, policy, but only also on the specific thing you're working on. So for in my case, what's going on with India policy or US-India relations and things like that. So it is I will say in some ways it's even the first Trump term, it's exhausting, partly from an analytical sense, but it's also you almost have to make sure that you take your blinders off. And it's one thing whatever you personally feel, about developments, you also have to kind of step back and look at it analytically, which I think for many is harder than it usually is. And I think the other difference this time is you have a President Trump who has, not just Republicans who lead both, who have a majority in both the Senate and the House of Republicans, House of Representatives, but also the court system, where we're going to see a lot of these things tested. So there is going to be a lot that's going on the foreign policy side, but I think at home there's going to be a lot of things that President Trump, through even what some are calling an unelected bureaucrat like Elon Musk, that's fairly taking decisions that are going to be tested in the courts. And President Trump might win these cases and therefore expand executive power. So a very different America in some ways for not just Americans, but the world to grapple with. And to be honest, there are some Americans who are supportive of that.
Yeah.
Others obviously will object to it.
And I think it's interesting to see because, we did see some of these like sort of echo chambers in the past as well. It seems to have been much more like exacerbated in the recent past. Elon Musk, I am very curious to ask you about because, of course, as someone who used to work at Twitter, it's been fascinating to see his role now as you said, unelected bureaucrat. He's obviously mastered at using X. He's really good at the messaging. His comments will make headlines. His tweets will make headlines. What's the feeling there in DC about how Doge has, or whatever, that Department of Government Efficiency is making waves?
I think there's kind of, you have heard in the past, not just Republicans, but others say that government needs to be updated. It needs to kind of get more efficient. There are redundancies built in, spending, there are things that should not be something the government does, and it should be outsourced to the private sector and things like that. But I think what people are struck by, again, some supportive, some very much in opposition, is that you're seeing the way this is being done, which is to give it to somebody who has not been elected, who doesn't have a confirmable position, but yet is in the White House and has brought a team that doesn't have much experience in government. In fact, comes from a number of Musk's companies, and not just experience, even in those companies, don't have experience, but are making moves that are unprecedented, not just in terms of the way they're going about for example, sending almost all federal government employees or significant number letters that say we'll offer you a buyout, essentially, as is done in the private sector, but also then getting access to the payment system in the Treasury Department. So I think this is where the reaction partly has been. Some are supporters. Supporters of the president actually think this is exactly what should be done. But there are others, including some Republicans, who are concerned that this is setting a precedent about executive power as well, because in the division here, there's supposed to be checks and balances, and between the Congress, the judiciary, so the legislative branch, judiciary, and executive. And this is going to test that. And I think people are taking some of these things to court. So it's going to be interesting times ahead. And then, this is on the Doge side. But there's also lots of questions about the influence of Musk and others from tech, but particularly him, on policy issues.
Yeah. I think I think Musk deserves his own chapter, Musk and his folks, and we should actually do a roundtable with some of the folks who've worked with him in the past. You focus a lot on the India-US side of things. When we're recording this, it's the 5th of February, and the headlines just came in, of course, of the first group of undocumented Indian immigrants being flown back. Can you take us through the implications and ramifications? Of course, India is not the first country that the US administration is doing this to, but it's been one of the big moments, right? And very defining moment. And US President Trump has been talking about why this needs to happen. Can you take us through a little bit of how you see this play out?
So I think for one, I just say, this is not a new issue in US-India relation. It's a long-running issue, but a few things have changed. There have been in the previous Trump administration, there were a few thousand, if I remember correctly, folks. People use different terms. People use everything from illegal alien to undocumented migrant to unauthorized migrant. And you saw Secretary Rubio in the readout of the Rubio Jaishankar meeting, the State Department referred to it as irregular migration. So pick your term. But undocumented or unauthorized migrants, there were several thousand, but not not reaching that level from India, not reaching that level. But you did see a number of people overstaying visas. That used to be where you saw these unauthorized migrants in the US from India. And then you started seeing, though, over the last few years, so one thing that changed is just the scale. You started seeing, I mean, your listeners would know the kind of, there was a movie about this, about the donkey route, the donkey route. Not, and the movie was about migrants going to the UK, but there are numbers who started coming to the US as well, both through the southern borders, but interestingly, a significant number through the northern border. That is from Canada and Mexico from the south, and then Canada from the north. That suddenly, so your scale has gone up, and the nature of these undocumented migrants. I think the second thing that changed is just the conversation about migration here. It is a political issue. President Trump arguably came to power because there were a significant number of people who thought that the US had become too permissive in terms of incorporating migrants. And so you saw him use that, the famous kind of Trump border wall, etc. And what you've seen now is this, that even President Biden, knowing that this was a political issue, so even India was accepting deported Indians even during the Biden administration. But what you're going to see is just the scale and the priority that this is being given. This is what President Trump said he was going to do during the election. The other thing that you've seen, I think, change is just the way this is being done, right? If you look at, you've used to work at a news channel, Amrita, you see this, they are making sure these are being documented by TV shows. So this is being made almost into a TV show. There are cameras following these deportation flights. They're doing them very speedily. They are pressing governments who are not accepting it. And then you see, as you saw, kind of in these migrants that were deported back to India, that these are being done in military aircraft. So it's kind of shock and awe in that sense, in a very different sense.
It really does send that message across, doesn't it? You're right. And they never made the headlines in this way before. So it is like a well-produced spectacle designed to also, I suppose, deter in many ways.
Exactly. It is supposed to say, this is what, the end result of your decision to use these donkey routes isn't citizenship in America. It is going to be a flight back to your homeland, possibly handcuffed, and probably in a military flight. There are some, for example, I don't know that there are any Indians included, but you never know because data is not, we don't have the data. But even migrants are being sent to Guantanamo Bay. If you remember that was where kind of, those accused of terrorism were being kept. I think the one, just on the final point I'll make is on kind of the impact. I think, you saw the Indian government, and this was predictable. I'll say that, even I, sitting on the outside, not privy to kind of government discussions, had said back in October, even before the election, that if Trump wins, this would be one of his asks. What you've seen is the Indian government, that probably, and reports indicate that they did, mapped out after he won what might his demands be and what can India do in some ways. So I think what you saw is these reports that India has agreed preemptively, so not waiting for Trump to tweet about it or threaten repercussions, is it seems that this might be something External Affairs Jaishankar might have mentioned in his trip, which is, we will take back these 18,500 folks who've been identified, and we will accept these deportees coming back. And they must have negotiated. I would not be surprised, having seen that the arrival was in Amritsar, that part of what they probably negotiated is where these flights would land, etc. I wasn't surprised that India accepted these deportation flights. I was a little bit surprised that India accepted that this would be on military aircraft. But nonetheless, it's clear that this is just like, in the budget, certain duties being of things that could be not, they didn't name Harley Davidson or things that could benefit Tesla, but certain import duties being dropped. So in advance, saying to Trump, look, we are actually willing to work with you on these things. And in this case, as Shashi Tharoor from the Congress Party has pointed out, in terms of these deportees, they should not be in the US, and they are Indian citizens, and India should accept them back. The one thing that India used to say, we don't want to take them back, is how do we know they're Indian? I think it's easier for India to verify these days thanks to Aadhaar and other digitization.
It's one of those things where it's so surreal right now to be talking to you about this, because I feel like, have you ever watched Mo? I'm watching Mo season 2, and there's this Palestinian American family, and what they have to go through waiting for asylum for 22 years, and the coyote trail he takes through Mexico, and he lands straight in an ICE detention center. It's actually bizarre, but I'm just thinking, between Netflix, the world, and what you're documenting and living through, it's pretty surreal. I do want to talk to you a little bit about the India US relationship evolving. You've tracked it for many years, but just before we get to that, you've been in the US for about 20 years, first as a student, studying for your PhD, and then, now with Brookings. And of course, you've done so many talks. You've been a policy analyst. You've been, focused on so many things there. How is it for your peers, your community, when you, as you said earlier, you have to kind of take a step back and look at what's going on analytically? But can you share any anecdotes on, mood implications for the Indian American community, if at all, and in the policy space?
I guess the kids call mood these days vibes, right? So, if you
Yes.
take a vibe check, I think it really depends on who you are, where you are. In some ways, you know, my peers are probably more privileged in the sense that we still have roofs over our head. We don't have to be worried about certain things. Having said that, think there is a lot of concern about what this means, depending on if those of us who work on foreign policy, we are watching, what does this mean for America's role in the world? For, in my case, no secret that I do think that the US and India should be competing with China. And I have concerns about China's assertiveness and its intentions. And so for me, it's that broad thing. You're worried about what does this mean for America's ability to compete in the world, to attract the best and brightest, to be able to indeed do the things that are necessary for America's interests that require good relationships with allies and partners over time, rather than kind of just a transactional set of moves. What people are thinking about kind of institutions and what it means. But I think it's also different depending on, have you been born and brought up here? Do you bring external experiences? For me, in some ways, some of this in terms of the business government interaction that we're seeing, the media interacting with government, media barons interacting with governments in a certain way, that's not exactly new. It's just that I think a number of people, you would hear people say, this can never happen in America. But I think what you're seeing is institutions can be strong, but the center only holds if people themselves stick to those norms and the institutions are strong enough to actually enforce the rules and norms. So I think, in terms of the vibe check, I think people at the moment, this is shock and awe. So I think there's a certain amount of just trying to grasp what is happening on a day to day basis. But also, I think I will say this, there is less surprise this time about a return to Trump than there was in 2017 for various reasons. So I think, the vibe check in Washington, probably very different from the vibe check in other parts of the country. But I think that's also partly, as I said, this is a one horse town. And when you're
Yeah.
talking about downsizing the federal government, that has very real consequences for people's jobs, people's funding, people's, even outside DC, people will have to start wondering, are they still going to get their college loans, still going to get their Medicaid? But in DC, it's a lot of it is about what is this going to mean for people's jobs?
I do want to ask you, not to put you on the spot, but from again, sometimes when you're outside and you're looking at the news through the media or tweets or whatever, it does skew the perception a bit. But have you seen, or have you felt, or have you heard of an uptick in racism at all? Or do you think that there is still this kind of rhetoric we're hearing about undocumented migrants? I mean, I know that there was that kind of when Sriram was named, right? The former Twitter exec was named. We saw a lot of this kind of, at least online, racist rhetoric against, I think it was Indian Americans at that time. Is there any concern there, or does that also seem to be part of this, as it unfolds?
But this should not have been unpredictable. People are. I've seen some, Indian Americans who are surprised about this. I've been saying this for years that, at the end of the day, there is a group of people who are not just, because Indians would say we are the model minority, we are the good immigrants, we've come legally. And the point I made is, yes, there are people who support legal migration and they're focused on. But at the end of the day, there is a group of people that doesn't want migration from countries that are not white. And so they don't make a distinction from, are you coming legally or illegally? Are you coming from, I don't know, Burkina Faso or India? They don't care. They do not want to see people who look like me in this country. That is not their vision of America. And it might be a small group, but nonetheless, it has become a very vocal group whose voices have become amplified. And I think you saw this debate, and it's shocked some people. It shouldn't have, I think. But you've seen this debate between, on this question of H1Bs. Some say it's all bots and trolls, but there is a sentiment amongst some that there is an America that they want to see, and it does not include people who look like you and me.
So many things to say on that. That's a whole separate spin-off we're going to do at some point, I think, just to talk about bias and racism. But let me bring back to some of the macro things I want to talk to you before we get to Tanvi Madan's journey. And I really want to highlight that for folks who are tuning in to Say Again for the first time. We do love to talk to leaders about their domain expertise, but we also love to hear about their own journeys and what they can share that can resonate with some of us. So two major questions, in terms of the macro, Tanvi, of course, you're tracking Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US. Hopefully we'll get these clips out before he lands, so nothing gets dated. What are some of the big things to look out for?
So I think one you'll just see with the thing to watch out for is the kind of personal dynamics between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. Partly because both leaders like the personal diplomacy style. I think you'll also see likelihood that part of this visit we're not going to necessarily see, though. With President Trump, even if India doesn't want to announce something or talk about discussions, he'll go out there and tweet about it. President Trump will, so we might actually hear about it. But some of this, I think, for Prime Minister Modi is to talk to President Trump about what India's value to the US, what India is willing to do, and he will probably make this thing that India is not asking for much. It's not an ally. It's in fact willing to burden share. But I think part of it is he'll want to shape President Trump's view about what India brings to the table. But also, I suspect he will want to talk to him about the situation and the landscape in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. There is a debate that is going to happening right now in the Trump administration about China. There are people, including sometimes the president himself, who want to do a deal with China. But I think there are others who are more competitive and concerned about Chinese assertiveness and the US power and position in the Indo-Pacific. And so I think part of what Prime Minister Modi will also be trying to do is have a broader conversation about the world with President Trump, and try to the extent possible, shape his views about the situation in the Indo-Pacific and say, look, in Asia, you actually have allies and partners who are willing to burden share with you. This is not about America doing things for the world and everybody just, free riding. I do think he is also going to want to hear what President Trump's priority asks are. I think they've anticipated some of them, but he will have to, and I think I would not be surprised if India is prepared to respond to some of those asks during the visit or sometime after. I think they would have done, as I said, that landscape study. So, I'm watching to see what we might hear, the kind of, again, to use the kids stuff, the vibes that come out of that meeting. And it'll likely follow Prime Minister Modi's visit to France, where he might actually come across JD Vance, the vice president, as well. You're also going to likely see, I would not be surprised if we saw an attempt to arrange a Modi Musk meeting and see what comes out of that. And that's interesting because, on the one hand, Elon Musk has a view of China that is at odds with India's view. But at the same time, he has been a defender of H-1B visas, which India cares about. And then there's the third dimension, which is that Elon has a lot of business in front of the Indian government.
Right.
So now I think that's something India has to grapple with, which is, for the first time, very explicitly so. So, some would say that, the US government has always kind of gone to bat for their businesses. But in this case, very specifically, if an India says yes or no to an Elon Musk, is that about Musk or is that about the US government now?
Starlink, Tesla. I mean, X is a tiny thing in the scheme of things, but I believe they're quite happy with. So that does bring us to, now you've said also in the past that India and the US should look at a sort of alliance when it comes to China, Chinese assertiveness. When we just see the the news from the last week, with DeepSeek and what's been happening with the sort of AI race, the race to AGI. I loved your tweet where you're like, everyone stop comparing this to a Sputnik moment. So I wanted to ask you, widely it's seen as a US versus China thing. Europe's really not in the game yet together. India needs to catch up or leapfrog. How do you look at this race, playing out from your perspective? And why did you say it's not a Sputnik moment?
So, this is related to that has more to do with, bad analogies. And if you're trained as a historian, you hate those. But I think, it's related to the previous question about, what I'm looking for. So one of the things I'm looking for is not just kind of the negative defense side, but the offense side of that trip is going to be try to deepen cooperation in defense and technology, and particularly critical and emerging technologies. And I think, this is another area where, yes, in some ways it's about the US and China, but it really is about, it's a global competition in some sense, which is why this has got that much attention, right? Who can offer a model, and in this case, at cost. That is what, people's focus has been on, right? The speed and cost. Now, I will caution everybody that I am not in the habit of taking the word of without actually seeing evidence of companies when they make claims about cost and speed and, frankly, originality. But nonetheless, I think one of the things this says is that this is not something that the US can do alone. The US might have the capacity, but for example, a lot of the AI kind of research and development and innovation happens because the US has been an open society that has welcomed high skilled immigrants, that has an education system, that has driven and private sector funding and investment in R&D, government investment in R&D, that has tried to kind of spark innovation and invest in innovation. The criticism has been in recent years that the US actually has forgotten how to do that in a way it did in the Cold War when it was last competing. But I think this is different, right, from the Cold War. In those cases, people were often talking about military technology, nuclear weapons. This is technology that is in everybody's phones, right? And so I think it's not just about the US and China. It will be about countries like India that the US can partner with. It can be even, and the India is not just a partner, it's a market. So what prevails there actually has something to do with kind of demand, the demand side of the equation too. So I think for me, this is not just a US China story. We should all be asking ourselves questions about, there's the, again, defense aspect of it. Were export controls not working that this company might have had access to chips it shouldn't have? This is both India and the US have tried to kind of put restrictions on China in various ways. And one question will be on the defense side. Are we doing enough to protect our technologies and our innovation? But the second part is on offense. Are we doing as much as possible? And this is a question for India as much as it is the US, to ensure that we are not just protecting our homes, but giving ourselves the capabilities to run faster and further than any other kind of, in this case, China. So I think, to me, this is absolutely a question. The reason I said it's not, let's not jump to the gun in Sputnik moment. That was a very specific, so, for your younger listeners, this was in the 1950s when there was the Soviet Union had kind of sent Sputnik to space, and it was 1957, and everybody basically said that the US, there was a missile gap, there was a space gap, and it really shocked the system in the US because it was something the US had done, had tested nuclear weapons before the Soviets did, but this was something the Soviets seemed to have a lead on, and it created the sense of angst, and it drove more investment in technology. Historians later found that actually that missile gap was not as big as thought, but it did drive both President Kennedy when he was running for office. He used that moment, but also it led to investments in the space sector, which eventually led to the US landing on the moon, becoming the first country to land on the moon. So to me, this is not one moment. To me, every year we seem to have a Sputnik moment with China. A few years ago, it was them producing a phone that was using chips that, and then we later found that those had been acquired around export controls. But nonetheless, it is not one moment. To me, I think the thing that I don't think either the US or frankly India have absorbed is the scale and the constancy and the frequency of these moments. And so it's going to have to be the kind of full court press, but constantly. So it's not one moment, it's not one project, it's the base. So investing in research and development across the system, investing in social infrastructure, health, education. That means that you will have citizens who can actually compete and innovate farther and faster. I mean, and it also shows you export controls can take you that far. Countries will find
Yeah.
ways of innovate. So how do you innovate even faster and further? And then seeing other areas where we can actually all collaborate for the good of mankind, as they used to say. The mood is not, the vibes are not there yet, but
I
nonetheless,
think,
I don't think this should be one moment. I think this
yeah.
should be an era.
Very interesting. I think they've started saying the good of mankind again. I feel like I saw something like that from OpenAI and others. We will have to wait and watch that. Tanvi, thank you so much for that perspective. Even though I know you said that AI is not really your core area, it's really interesting how it all ties in. Which is why I want to ask you now, what was it that kicked off this entire journey of yours? Take your time. I know it's a big question, but were you always interested in history? Were you always interested in foreign affairs, strategy, foreign policy? What kicked off your interest in this field?
I think part of it is was I love good storytelling. When we grew up, Amrita, there wasn't like TV or definitely no internet, no cell phones, and so you read. And part of what I read was about the world, and the newspapers used to invest a lot in those days in covering international. We used to get some international magazines. They always used to come a little bit late, but nonetheless they did. And it used to be because I think also somebody had to look through, are there any maps of India that they had to stamp, not authorized by government of India, etc. But nonetheless, for me it was the times that my formative years were kind of the 80s, early 90s, and that was a time of such massive global change that directly affected India. I mean, we went from having, kind of very close partnership with the Soviet Union to the Soviet Union collapsing, very close partnerships with the Eastern Europeans, and the Warsaw Pact countries, but also all these Soviet republics. That all collapsed. You saw the Middle East, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which eventually led to an oil shock, and in India's case, a budget shock. So the opening up, all that was happening at the time, which made very clear to me that our lives in India and our personal lives, suddenly we went from having like Doordarshan and watching Bunyad and Humlog to having all these international channels and CNN showing us live what was happening with the first Gulf War, to soap operas suddenly coming, where you saw these American lifestyles in ways. uh, Before that, we used to the extent we got foreign TV, it was like Yes Prime Minister, so very British influence. Just this sheer. So for me, that interest really came in both this kind of, I read a lot. I was interested in reading, and sometimes historians can be very good storytellers, and history is storytelling. It's analytical, it's theory as well, but it is a good historian is a storyteller, and so I used to like that. But also, I think there's the times I lived in and hearing conversations around the dinner table where I had relatives who disagreed with each other, who debated issues, but who also, talked about these issues in very substantive ways, not just kind of opinion, but debating ideologies, how open India should be, who India should partner with. And I found this all very fascinating. So that's
From
what took me to it. Was a bit personal, but it was also the times we lived in at that time.
It's really funny. The corollary to this is like, I still remember, and I couldn't understand as a 14 or 15-year-old. So we'd have these postings, and you just said about the international magazines coming a bit late. I could not understand why my parents would be poring over like 1 to 2 month old newspapers. They'd have this stack of like, Indian newspapers and just going over details. And I was like, this is dated. Like, this is so old. What are you doing? And they're like, you'll understand one day, this need to stay in touch and keep informed. So again, for our younger listeners, you have no idea what we're talking about, because everything is right now, unless your Wi-Fi conks off, you are very well aware of what's going on. So Tanvi, you studied at LSR in DU for college, and then you went on to do your master's at Yale, I saw, and then decided to go ahead and do a PhD. We were just chatting a little bit before we started about how, in retrospect, especially when you talk to younger people, but there's so much pressure at that age to decide what you want to be for the rest of your life, and it can feel very crippling. It can feel, of course, looking at other people, maybe 20, 22 years in, that their careers were very linear. They must have known. And in your case, again, as we just spoke about, you had this interest. It just feels like you went straight for it and things fell into place. Take us through a little bit of the behind the scenes of that.
It's related to a question that I still struggle with, and I don't know what the right answer is, which is, we were told, we were expected at 17 years old, and I mean, for younger listeners, 17 in those days was very different from 17 today. I feel like people are much more kind of know their choices, have thought through this. 17-year-olds seem older today now than we were then. But you're expected to choose, even if you want to go do, liberal arts as I did, or didn't not. You're expected first, actually, even when you're 15, you're supposed to make these big decisions on science and, commerce or arts, which then define the rest if there's a path dependence after that. So there's a lot of pressure. And so I actually ended up choosing science partly because I thought, it'll leave the other options open just in case, because I wasn't prepared to make that decision. But also at 17, you're supposed to decide then and there what you want to do. And those aren't, in some ways, I prefer the US system where, you do a little bit of a lot, it's left open at 17, and then while you're doing your undergraduate degree, you figure out what you want to do. But then, you hear complaints here that doesn't give you direction sometimes. It's kind of too loosey-goosey. So still struggling with that. But for me, I did history at LSR. I was interested in that. But I also didn't want to do after that what was expected at the time. And if you were a girl, that was, you either get married or you go to a master's. And I don't want to, frankly, do either of them. But I definitely didn't want to do a master's. So I kind of, butthole for a while, wandered around. I was actually quite lost. So again, people think, straight line graph. No, it wasn't linear. I actually tried, I was bummed around for a bit till my father sat me down and says, you need to do something. I don't care what you do, you need to, do something. And so I tried a few different things. I was interested, in those days, I thought, India should be getting the kind of tourists that European countries do. We have so much more in terms of culture and heritage. And so I had said, I've done history. I wanted to go figure out like a job that I could do in tourism management. And so I actually did apply for some of the hotel management. It didn't exist as a field. And then I ended up doing an internship at International Travel House, which was in the Moria, what used to be the Moria Sheraton at the time. Tried it out, but it was a travel agency. This again didn't exist. Today, I would find the financing for a startup and maybe create an app and stuff. Those days, people, this was not a possibility. So I tried these different things, and you try it. I went off to Bangalore, where in those days there were a lot of startups. There were portals, city portals, and I had taught myself to code a little bit. So I went to work in tech, and part of this was getting out of Delhi, but part of this was also that was the only skill I kind of had. So I taught myself to code. In those days, you actually had to code websites. I did a little bit more training there, so worked for one of these portals. Then came back to Delhi, worked a bit in SpectraNet. Had there was a kind of, I don't know if it still exists, but an internet network. But worked for their kind of content side, again designing things. I'd done some graphic design. So I tried out all these things, but one thing by doing these things, I also learned it was fun. It was nice. It was a good skill to learn, but it's not what I wanted to do, and that I really wanted to do international relations. So while doing all this, I had also applied. And by the way, I even considered law school at one point, and applied to the National Law School. I don't think
who didn't at that point, I have to say. I said who didn't at that point. I also did, and did not make the cut, I have to say.
It's a fork in the road thing, right?
Yeah.
Had I got in,
it's a fork in the road. Yeah,
I might have had a very different career.
Yes.
But I didn't get in. And so, this is the other thing. People think because they tend to hear our success story.
Yes.
But the number of rejections, whether in the entrance exams, whether, when I was applying for master's degrees, whether even PhD, you get a lot of rejections. And so, when people get rejections, don't be disheartened. Either try again or try something else. It's not often personal. Sometimes you're just not the right fit for a program, for something like that. So for me, it was really I tried different things. And frankly, I had the privilege to, right? I knew that I could work through this without that, I had parents who provided me food and shelter, and I wasn't going to be out in the streets. Not everybody has the luxury of doing that. So, I do want to acknowledge that sometimes you don't have the opportunity to be able to kind of working through this. Again, fork in the road. I'd gotten to a university in the UK. I could have gone there, but part of it is the UK was very similar to the Indian system, and I wanted to push myself and see something different. And
Mhm.
so I came to the US for to do international relations at Yale. And I arrived a few weeks before 9/11, which changed things dramatically here. And
Yikes.
so ended up kind of working a lot in that field, working at Brookings after that for 3 years, and then realizing I needed to do my PhD if I wanted to stay in this field. Um, Ended up, applying to a few different places, and for me, it came down to between Cornell and the University of Texas is at Austin's policy school. And part of the reason the Cornell's an Ivy. People have often wondered why I didn't go there because it wasn't the right fit for me at that time. But also, I wanted to get out of the Northeast. I thought that I needed to experience a different part of the US. And I will say that actually has helped me get a broader view of America,
Mm.
not living in another blue state, but also, you know, thinking about how different parts of the country think about America. And so one of the efforts I've tried to make is travel around the country. Anytime I get the opportunity, I'll go to Alabama, I'll go to Wyoming. I was just in North Carolina. So to actually hear people and what they're interested in, as their views are, to push yourself to get out of that echo chamber that sometimes we can build, or that is very comfortable and we can build around ourselves.
Yeah. And Austin, isn't that where a lot of the tech, Musk and is trying to move? I think Joe Rogan is based there. So you have had a sense of the whole country in that one.
I was there before, so Dell was there. The company with
Ah,
Dell was
yes.
there,
I'm just
and
saying, if they
yeah.
ever want to put out feelers, they'll be like, Tanvi's our gal. Like she's not
Well,
just in.
I don't know. I was there pre Musk and Rogan and all the move, and I hear others are moving. Then right now, I don't blame them. Austin's a lovely town, but it's a very different town
I'm sure, yeah,
than
yeah.
it was when I was there.
But it's really interesting because you have made sure to challenge yourself, push yourself also out of your comfort zone. I'm just going to keep an eye on time and ask you two final quick questions for now, though I definitely want to have you back on later this year, hopefully. One is there anything you're reading or watching that is you'd like to recommend? It could be super serious, could be, well, given your line of work, it could be super fun, given your line of work. So anything you're reading or watching?
I think it's incredibly important, especially in these days of kind of uncertainty and you're constantly the exhaustion of kind of keeping up with things to do fun stuff. So I unashamedly watch, things that I watch reality shows. I'll watch HGTV, which is Home and Garden TV. So it's a show about like what following people reconstructing their homes or buying homes. And I watch sports. I am a fan of American football, believe it or not. Or when cricket is on, I do that. But the thing I just finished watching, which actually does have these themes of the border, fentanyl, is the second season of this show called Lioness. And it's got Nicole Kidman
Hmm.
and a few others who you'll recognize. But what's fascinating to me about the second season, it's one of the few times in a Hollywood show that you've seen China being mentioned as the bad guy. Because of Hollywood wanting to do business in China, you rarely
Yeah,
saw that in the way
yeah,
that, they were still like most of the villains were usually kind of in the Middle East. It's like, the wars in
yeah,
Afghanistan and Iran, Iraq had continued.
yeah.
But first time I saw, China but very actively being and very early in the show. So that's something. It's an interesting show. It's a bit kind of masala show, and it's not. Some of it is totally over the top. I'm not sure it would be at all realistic. And then the thing that I'm not reading, but I just learned is coming out very soon, and I can't wait for is Srinath Raghavan's book about Indira Gandhi and the years that
Oh,
changed India. And I can't tell you how long I've been waiting for that
oh,
book.
really?
And I can't. It's the book that I would suggest that everybody, if not pre-order, make sure and order as soon as it comes out in May or June.
I love it. Okay. And then final question as we wind down for the moment. Anything you're grateful for at this moment?
Family, friends, and health. As one gets older, you realize how precious those things are. Selfishly so, it's a source of support, but also just irreplaceable in many ways. So those three things.
I love that. And that is so profound and that's so true. I love that. Thank you so much, Tanvi, for sharing so much. And as always, so articulately and so honestly and openly. I definitely hope we get to connect again soon. Really appreciate your taking the time.
It was great chatting with you, Amrita.